Everything began with a single gunshot that shattered the silence of Lake Harrison at dawn, one that no one could explain. A whisper followed. A door creaked open. Harold Whitman stood barefoot on the porch, staring into the woods as if they were calling his name. But what he said next froze Margaret where she stood. He claimed he remembered something he had never spoken of in over 50 years. And that's when the real questions began: who had come to the cabin uninvited? What was hidden in the basement no one dared open? And why had the lake suddenly stopped reflecting the sky? But before we begin, write in the comments where you're from. I'm curious to see how far these stories can travel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new captivating tales. Let's begin. The lake was a mirror that morning, too still to be natural, too calm for what was coming. Margaret always said that Lake Harrison had moods, and when it held its breath like this, something was bound to break. Harold Whitman sat in his favorite chair, the one with the fraying cushion and the carved eagle armrest he'd sanded down one summer after retirement, staring into the still water with a gaze that carried more questions than memories. He had once lectured on classical philosophy, filled auditoriums with the slow rhythm of thought and the firm certainty of logic, but now even simple memories were starting to feel like strangers passing in the street. Margaret had learned to recognize the fog in his eyes before he did. She could tell by the way his hand would hover over the crossword puzzle a second too long, or how he'd suddenly ask if they'd already eaten breakfast, even while crumbs from toast still lingered on his shirt. But she never corrected him harshly. Not once. She would place a hand on his shoulder, look straight into him, and speak like she was anchoring him to the earth. That summer, they had promised each other a season of peace. Just them, the cabin, the lake, and the kind of quiet you only find when you know your days are numbered and every one of them is priceless. They had kept the world out. No TV. No phone calls. No politics. No news. And then the letter came. It arrived in a weathered envelope, postmarked from Charlotte, with a return address neither of them recognized. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was unmistakable, strong, slanted, fiercely independent. Laura. Margaret read it aloud twice, her voice catching only once. Their daughter was coming. After 7 years of silence, after holidays missed and apologies never spoken, she was driving up to the cabin, with her fiancé and his teenage son. No explanations. Just a date and a time. She never even asked if it was all right, Harold said, his voice flatter than usual, like the sentence was a coat that didn't fit anymore. He didn't ask for details. Didn't ask what she'd written. Just nodded, stood up, and walked out to the porch without putting on his shoes. On the day of their arrival, Margaret cooked. That was how she braced herself for battle, kneading bread like it was fate's throat, stirring soup as though she could change the past by how long she let it simmer. The smells filled the old wooden cabin like memories of a life that almost worked. They heard the crunch of tires on gravel first. The boy was the first to step out. Tall, lanky, with a black hoodie and that strange teenage quiet that makes you feel like you're the one who doesn't belong. The man came next, Laura's fiancé. Clean-cut, too clean, with a firm handshake and a smile that felt like a firm fence rather than an open gate. Then Laura. The same sharp jaw. The same eyes that had once cut through lies like a blade. But her expression held something new now, some strange, almost foreign softness. A weight in the way she stood. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, Mom," she said, as if the 7 years had been nothing but a weekend space. As if time hadn't hardened everything between them like frost on a windshield. They didn't speak much that first evening. Conversation stayed on surface waters. Weather. Roads. Gas prices. The boy, his name was Eli, barely spoke. He watched Harold more than anyone, though. Not with contempt. With curiosity. As if trying to place him. Harold was quiet too, but something inside him had shifted, like a beam in the attic that cracked just enough to make the walls sigh. He kept glancing toward the woods behind the cabin, where the trees stood thicker than they should have been. That night, after the others had gone to sleep, Margaret found Harold outside, standing barefoot again, staring into the trees. The moonlight made his skin look pale and unearthly. "Do you hear it?" he asked. "Hear what, love?" He turned to her, that fog thick in his eyes again. "Something's moving out there. Same way it did, back then." "Back when, Harold?" He didn't answer. Inside the cabin, Eli was still awake, sitting by the window, sketching in a notebook he hadn't let anyone see. The page he worked on held the outline of an old man. A man standing at the edge of the woods. But behind that man was something darker. Something tall. Watching. The next morning, Harold didn't recognize Laura. He came into the kitchen, looked at her across the table, and asked Margaret who the young lady was and why she looked upset. Laura tried to laugh. Tried to make a joke. But her face crumpled just enough to show the hurt before she covered it. Later that afternoon, Eli followed Harold down to the dock. No one told him to. He just did. The two of them sat in silence for a while, legs dangling over the water. "You used to teach?" Eli asked finally. Harold looked over, eyes sharper than they had been all morning. "Once," he said. "But some knowledge isn't meant to stay in the mind. It rusts. It bleeds out through the cracks." Eli nodded. Didn't ask for more. That night, as the wind picked up and the trees began to groan, something strange happened. A photo, one Margaret hadn't seen in years, fell from a book she hadn't touched in a decade. It was Harold, Laura, and a little girl she didn't recognize. In the background was the cabin. But something was wrong. The photo had been taken in daylight. Yet, through the window of the cabin behind them, everything inside was pitch black. And in that darkness, if you looked close, you could just make out the faint outline of a figure. Standing. Watching. Waiting. Margaret kept that photograph close for the rest of the night, tucked inside the pocket of her sweater like a secret prayer. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. She just sat by the hearth with the fire low and her thoughts running deeper than the lake ever dared. The image haunted her, not for what it revealed, but for what it refused to explain. The shadow in the window hadn't been dust or glare or time's slow decay, it had weight, shape, presence. And Margaret, though she'd never said a word of it aloud, had seen something like it before, years ago, when Laura was still a child and Harold's lectures hadn't yet begun to scatter like leaves in wind. Back then, the nights were different. The wind had more voices. The floorboards creaked even when no one moved. She had always chalked it up to old wood, raccoons, or the strange acoustics of a lakeside cabin. But now, sitting there in the faint flicker of firelight, her breath caught every time the wind scraped a branch across the roof. By morning, Harold had returned to himself, or at least to the version of himself that still fit inside the shell of now. He made coffee. He buttered toast. He called Margaret by name without hesitation and even offered Eli a slice of bacon with a wry smirk and a rare glint in his eye. Laura emerged later, eyes swollen, face washed with that particular shade of regret only a daughter can wear when trying to mend something she helped break. She watched her father closely all morning, not with pity, but with a quiet desperation, like someone trying to memorize a song before the last note fades. Eli, ever the observer, was drawn to the basement. He asked about it over lunch, casually, like one might ask about the weather or an old family recipe. "What's down there?" he said, gesturing to the trapdoor hidden beneath the faded rug in the back room. Margaret stiffened. Harold didn't answer. Laura looked confused. "We don't use the basement anymore," Margaret said after a pause. "Not since the flood years ago. Mold got in everything." But Eli didn't ask again. He just nodded, eyes lingering on the rug for a beat too long before returning to his plate. Later that day, Harold and Eli walked into town together, an idea that seemed to come from Harold himself, which was rare and welcome. The path was shaded, full of loose stone and winding turns, but Harold took each step with purpose, like a man trying to beat a clock only he could hear ticking. They stopped at an old general store, the kind that smelled of oil lanterns, dusty rope, and secrets soaked into wooden shelves. While Harold spoke with the shopkeeper, an old friend named Dell, who'd once worked with him on a historical series about Appalachian folklore, Eli wandered the aisles until something caught his eye. It was a thin leather-bound journal tucked between a row of fishing maps and faded postcards. It didn't have a price tag. It didn't look new. But it called to him in a way that had nothing to do with reason. When he opened it, the first page was filled with handwritten notes in a looping, precise script. The words were dense, but a single phrase jumped out in jagged underlines, "The Watcher of Harrison Pines." Eli froze. He glanced at Harold, who was still laughing with Dell like the world wasn't splitting at its seams. He slipped the journal into his coat and said nothing. Back at the cabin, Margaret noticed Harold's sudden surge of energy had worn off. He didn't finish his tea. He didn't speak at dinner. When the sun dipped behind the hills, he took to the porch again, this time with a blanket across his knees and that hollow look returning to his face like a visitor too familiar to refuse. Laura came out, sat beside him, and tried again. "Do you remember when we used to fish off the dock, Dad? You told me the lake was alive." He nodded slowly. "I said it listens," he murmured. "Not that it's alive." Laura hesitated. "What did you mean?" Harold didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, staring across the glassy water, eyes searching the shoreline for something no one else could see. "I meant," he said finally, voice thin as smoke, "that it knows what we leave behind. It doesn't forget." That night, Eli read the journal in the attic, his flashlight throwing long shadows across the slanted ceiling. The entries were dated between 1952 and 1971, all signed with the same initials, RJW. They spoke of a figure seen in the woods, a tall, narrow presence, always near water, always silent. The writer claimed it watched from the tree line at dusk, never moving, never blinking. The entries became more erratic as the years passed. By the final pages, RJW was convinced the entity could affect memory. That people would lose time. That entire days would vanish. That it fed not on bodies, but on forgetting. The last page read, "If you see it once, it knows your face. If you see it twice, it knows your name. If you see it a third time, you're already part of it." Eli put the journal down and listened. The wind had stopped. Not faded. Stopped. He crept downstairs in the dark, past the soft murmurs of Laura and Margaret speaking by candlelight, past Harold's room where the old man breathed in the slow rhythm of dreamless sleep. And then he stood at the rug. The one covering the basement trapdoor. It wasn't locked. He lifted the edge, expecting dust, old boxes, maybe some forgotten tools. Instead, he saw stairs. Clean. Dry. And at the bottom, something faint. Light. He stepped down. 1 stair. 2. The wood didn't creak. The air didn't move. Halfway down, he heard something. A whisper. It wasn't calling his name. Not yet. But it was close. And when he looked up, just for a moment, he thought he saw someone standing at the top of the stairs behind him. Someone he didn't recognize. Someone watching. Eli never told anyone what he saw in that basement, not because he wanted to protect them, but because he wasn't entirely sure it had actually happened. His mind, ever cautious, ever rational, tried to pin the experience to fatigue or the strange acoustics of an old wooden home. But when he looked in the mirror the next morning and saw a faint line of dried earth on his neck, like a finger had traced his throat while he slept, he understood something deeper had been stirred. Upstairs, Margaret was already sweeping the porch, humming a hymn only half remembered from childhood church pews, her broom swaying like a metronome set to memory. Laura brewed coffee with too much focus, trying to push grief away with the steady hand of routine, but it kept leaking into the corners of her eyes. Harold sat by the window, still as a painting, watching the trees. When Margaret brought him his tea, he turned and asked her if the boy, meaning Eli, had mentioned the basement yet. She stopped mid-step. "No, Harold. He hasn't," she said carefully, unsure whether she was speaking to the man she'd married or a stranger wearing his face. Harold nodded, more to himself than anyone else. "He will," he whispered. "They always do." Eli, for his part, avoided eye contact the rest of the morning. He stayed outside, sketching again, this time drawing something abstract, sharp lines, dark valleys, eyes without faces. When Margaret brought him a sandwich, she didn't ask about the drawing, but her hand lingered on his shoulder just a second too long. She felt it then, something inside him had changed. A thread had been tugged. Around noon, Laura found the journal. She hadn't been looking for it. In fact, she had been searching through Eli's duffel for aspirin, since her temples had been pounding since dawn. The leather spine poked out between his clothes like a secret trying to breathe. She opened it and read in silence. By the third page, her hands began to tremble. By the fifth, she stopped breathing entirely. She took the journal outside to Margaret, said nothing, and handed it over like it was a live grenade. Margaret, reading quickly, grew pale. When she reached the last entry, she looked up at the tree line across the lake and said the name aloud for the first time in 27 years. Rufus Jeremiah Whitman. Laura blinked. "That's not." "It's Harold's father," Margaret said, voice flat as winter ground. "He drowned in this lake in 1971. Or that's what they told us." That night, no one slept. They didn't say it out loud, but each of them understood something had breached the surface of the summer, and now everything felt like a countdown. Margaret sat by the fire again, Harold by the window, Laura pacing like a woman trying to outrun a sentence that had already been passed. Eli, unable to sit still, returned to the trapdoor. This time, when he lifted it, he didn't descend. He listened. There was breathing down there. Not wind. Not the sound of old pipes or shifting beams. Breathing. He lowered the door gently and placed the rug back like a man covering a grave. The next day, Laura pressed Harold harder than before. She brought up names from his youth, his students, his old lectures, their favorite family trips, his father. Each time, he responded in fragments, like someone trying to recall a book he'd never read but heard about in detail from someone he used to love. Then, in the middle of slicing apples for a pie that never got made, he dropped the knife and said, "Rufus didn't drown. He walked into the lake and disappeared. He said the watcher had called him." The silence that followed was the kind that makes your blood slow down. Laura stepped forward. "You said that when I was 6. Harold turned, eyes glassy but clear. "Because it's true. I remembered it again this morning. I remember everything now. And I wish I didn't." Eli stayed close to the woods that evening, sketchbook clutched in one hand like a weapon. He had started drawing the figure, not from memory, but from something deeper, some place in his mind that had never belonged to him until now. The watcher had no face. Just a long, bent body that seemed to absorb light. It stood with its arms hanging at its sides, too long for the body, too still to be natural. It was always near water. Always. As dusk fell, Margaret took the journal and marched into the woods behind the cabin. She hadn't told anyone, but she had to know if the marker was still there. The one she and Harold had carved into a pine after his father vanished. RJW 1971. A promise never to forget. It was still there. But now, beneath it, was something new. 3 lines. Freshly carved. Deep. Almost angry. She ran back faster than her knees wanted to carry her. When she reached the cabin, Laura was standing on the porch, tears in her eyes, pointing across the lake. "There," she whispered. Do you see it? And they did. At the far edge of the water, standing just beyond the trees, was a shape. Tall. Still. Facing them. Harold stepped forward. That's the third time, he said. It knows us now. Eli turned to him, voice shaking. What does it want? Harold smiled. Not with joy, but with the finality of a man who has just remembered how the story ends. It wants what was promised. And inside the cabin, the trapdoor creaked open. No one had touched it. The cabin breathed that night, walls expanding and contracting like the chest of something old that never truly slept. The floorboards pulsed with a rhythm no one had taught them, and the wind, though soft, carried a sound just beyond the human register, like a prayer being whispered by something that had never known grace. Margaret barred the trapdoor with a chair, then a trunk, then the old iron poker from the fireplace, her hands shaking with a quiet fury born not of fear, but betrayal. She had trusted this land. She had trusted the silence. But silence, she now understood, was not the same as peace. It was the sound a predator makes when it's close enough not to bother running. Laura sat on the couch with a blanket clutched to her chest, eyes red, voice gone. Since she had seen the figure across the lake, something had changed in her, not like a broken bone, but like a dam that had cracked and wouldn't stop leaking. Harold stood in the kitchen with the old rifle he hadn't fired since the Carter administration. He didn't remember where the bullets were. He didn't care. It was the gesture that mattered, the echo of protection in a house that had once belonged to dreams. And Eli, upstairs in the attic, traced the shape of the watcher in charcoal again and again, each sketch more detailed, more complete, as though his hands had seen something his eyes could not. He didn't question it anymore. The lines came from somewhere beyond memory, beyond understanding, like an ancient melody hummed by a stranger you somehow know. Just after midnight, something knocked on the door. Not a fist. Not a hand. Something slow. Measured. Heavy. One knock. Then nothing. No one moved for several minutes, not even to breathe too loudly. Then Harold stepped forward, rifle shaking slightly in his hands, and reached for the knob. No, Margaret said, voice steel. It's not a visitor. But Harold opened the door anyway. There was nothing there. Just fog. Thick. Wet. Rolling into the house like it had business inside. They closed the door, bolted it, and backed away like children who had just been caught in a lie too big to explain. And from beneath the rug, they heard the chair shift. Not fall. Shift. As if moved by a careful hand. Laura ran for her son, but Eli was already coming down the stairs, sketchbook under one arm, journal under the other. His face was pale, not with fear, but with certainty, the kind you only see on soldiers and surgeons and children who've already seen too much. I read the last page, he said, voice steady. There's more under the cover. A second layer. Scratched into the leather. Margaret took the book, peeled back the inner lining with a paring knife, and found the words written in trembling scrawl. The third sight is the opening. The fourth is the offering. The fifth is the return. Laura whispered the words aloud, as though trying them on her tongue like a foreign language she'd never meant to speak. What does it want? She asked again, this time not to Harold, but to the air itself. And the lights flickered. Just once. But in that flicker, every shadow in the cabin seemed to move in a way light could never explain. Harold stepped forward, placed the rifle on the mantel like a man surrendering something heavier than wood and metal. I broke the promise, he said. I was supposed to return. I was supposed to finish what my father started. They didn't understand. So he told them. In 1971, when Harold was a young man with a temper and a taste for answers, he followed his father into the woods after midnight. Rufus had been writing in the journal for months, speaking to things that weren't there, drawing sigils in the dirt, murmuring about watchers and agreements made long before Harold was born. That night, Rufus took Harold to the lake and said the time had come. "There's a price to knowledge," he said. "A toll to memory. The watcher keeps balance." Then he walked into the water and didn't come out. Harold had been too afraid to follow. Too afraid to ask. He buried the truth, locked the journal away, and never returned to the basement. But the watcher had not forgotten. Promises, after all, are not made to be ignored. They are made to be kept. Or paid for. "I saw it again when you were a little girl," he told Laura, tears threading down his face like cracks in stone. "And that was the second time." Eli stared at him. "And tonight was the third." Harold nodded. "It knows me. But now it knows you." That was when the banging began, not at the door, not from the basement, but on the roof. Something was walking up there. Slow. Deliberate. It circled twice. Then stopped. They held each other like sandbags in a rising flood, as if their arms could stop what centuries had already set in motion. The next morning, the watcher was gone. No footprints. No signs. No broken branches or claw marks or cryptic symbols. Just silence. But Harold was gone too. His bed untouched. His slippers by the door. The rifle still on the mantel. Only the front door was open, swinging slightly in the breeze. And on the edge of the dock, where the lake lapped at the wood like a mouth-tasting memory, there sat a single item. A page from the journal. Blank. Except for one line. "The fourth is the offering." The morning after Harold vanished, the lake lay so still it seemed to mourn, its glass surface untouched by wind, wake, or time. The birds didn't sing. The trees didn't stir. It was the kind of silence that spoke with authority, a silence earned, not given, like the hush that follows a verdict no one dares appeal. Margaret found his robe folded neatly on the porch bench, a mug of cold coffee resting beside it, as though he had simply stepped out for a moment and meant to return before the steam faded. But she knew better. She had known the moment the door creaked open in the night and the wind shifted to carry something other than air. Harold hadn't left. He'd been taken back. Laura refused to believe it at first. She searched the woods with a fury that came from the same place inside her that had once made her scream as a child when she lost sight of him at the fair. She called his name again and again, louder each time, until her voice frayed at the edges like rope soaked too long in salt water. But no answer ever came, not from the trees, not from the lake, and not from the past. Eli stood at the water's edge, holding the journal with both hands, his eyes fixed on the faint ripples moving in slow, perfect circles. He hadn't slept. Hadn't spoken. Something in him had shifted permanently, like a door once opened that could never be closed again. The sketches in his notebook had changed too, less monstrous, more human now. The watcher no longer looked like something hiding in shadow. It looked like something waiting in the light. Later that afternoon, Margaret sat everyone down at the kitchen table, the same table where birthdays had been sung, arguments had been waged, and forgiveness had once tried to bloom but never quite took root. The sunlight filtered through the old lace curtains like dappled memory, and for a moment, it almost felt like nothing had changed. "I've read that journal 5 times now," she began, her voice calm in the way only a widow could understand. "And I think I know what the offering means." Laura reached for her hand, but Margaret pulled it back gently, like a mother letting go of a child's fingers on the first day of school. "He didn't die," she continued. "Not in the way we think. The watcher takes something different. It feeds on memory, yes, but only the kind we run from." Laura frowned. "Then why Dad?" "He was already losing his memory." Margaret's gaze held steady. "Because he was ready to give it willingly. That's the difference. He remembered the promise." They sat in silence until Eli stood suddenly and walked out the front door without a word. Margaret didn't call after him. She simply nodded, as if she'd known he would go. Down at the dock, Eli sat at the edge and pulled the final page from the journal, the one that had appeared after Harold disappeared, the one that had only one sentence. But now, another line had been etched beneath it, as though written by a hand that no longer belonged to the living. The 5th is the return. He stared at the lake, the same lake that had taken Harold's father, and now Harold himself. And in that moment, a decision settled in his chest, not with fear, but with clarity. He stood up, stripped to his shirt and jeans, and stepped into the water. Laura reached him as the water reached his chest. "Eli, what are you doing?" she cried, her voice trembling like dry leaves in wind. He turned, soaked, shivering, but more certain than she'd ever seen him. "I think I'm supposed to finish this," he said. Laura stepped forward, but Margaret held her back. "If he's the 5th, then he's not being taken," Margaret said. "He's bringing something back." As the water reached Eli's shoulders, a fog began to rise, not like mist, but like breath, thick and warm and pulsing from the center of the lake. The ripples changed direction. The wind reversed. The birds returned, but did not sing. They only watched. Eli reached the center of the lake and stopped. Then the water around him began to glow, not bright, not radiant, but with a soft, golden hue, like sunlight through old whiskey glass. Shapes moved beneath the surface. Not fish. Not debris. Shapes that almost looked like people. Almost. Margaret whispered something no one could hear. Laura held her breath. And from beneath the lake, a figure rose. At first, they didn't recognize him. The hair was longer. The face thinner. But then he spoke. "Is the coffee still terrible?" Harold said, voice hoarse but alive. Margaret collapsed to her knees. Laura screamed. Eli swam to the edge and laughed through his tears, the sound full of something not even time could name. Harold stepped onto the dock, dripping but whole, and hugged Margaret like he had just come home from war. That night, they lit every candle in the cabin and sat together in the living room, wrapped in blankets and stories. Harold didn't remember where he'd gone. Not fully. But he remembered the feeling, like standing inside someone else's memory, like walking through forgotten summers and half-finished prayers. Eli kept the journal, but the last 2 lines had vanished. Just blank paper now. And in the attic, the final drawing he made showed the lake at sunset, quiet and calm, no shadow in sight. No watcher. Just a cabin, a dock, and 5 chairs facing the water. The offering had been made. The promise kept. And somewhere, deep in the woods behind them, the trees finally sighed like a burden had been lifted. The lake, after all, remembers. But sometimes, if you love it back, it forgives. Write in the comments where you're from, let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.